Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Exploring Climate Action Opportunities for Sustainable and Resilient Agriculture. My name is Ben Hush with NCSL, and I'll be your moderator today. This is the fourth webinar in the Energy, Environment, and Transportation Fall 2020 webinar series, which we are hosting in lieu of the 2020 Legislative Summit in Indianapolis. Of course, we miss seeing everyone, but hopefully we can get through this pandemic together and see each other in person as soon as it is healthy and safe to do so. In addition to today's webinar, we have one more lined up for you 2 weeks from today that will focus on permanently switching to daylight saving time. However, if you missed the first 3 webinars of this series, you can find a complete schedule, recordings, and registration details for our final webinar at www.ncsl.org. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next hour or so, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box to the left of your screen. We've all had plenty of time now, it seems, to get used to these online platforms, so don't be shy. To begin building some comfort with the chat function and also to learn who is on the line today, I invite everyone to type in the state from which we're calling from now. We will hold a more formal Q&A after both of our presenters finish presenting. Our webinar today is being recorded, and all registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website after the webinar completes. We will send out a notice once those resources are made available. Additionally, you can download the presentation slides being used today by clicking on the Resources tab and the Speaker's bio in the Speakers tab at any time during the presentation. Now, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get back to why we're here today. There is, of course, no denying that climate change is a complex and global issue requiring a policy response that is both thoughtful and informed. Thus far, this response has seen the implementation of emission reduction requirements on both the transportation and energy sectors. And while American farmers and ranchers continue to improve their production efficiencies, conservation of natural resources, and resiliency, the formal role and responsibilities for the agriculture sector remain uncertain. So today we are going to explore and discuss some policies, technologies, and other initiatives that may provide a role for the ag sector to develop effective and sustainable practices in response to this complex issue. Here with us today to talk through these issues are 2 excellent speakers representing key stakeholders in this conversation: Jenny Hopkinson with the National Farmers Union and Mackenzie Landa with the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. First, we will hear from Jenny Hopkinson, who serves as a senior government affairs representative with the National Farmers Union, where she advocates for family farmers, ranchers, and rural communities in Congress and the executive branch. Her work focuses on climate change, policy, and trade issues. Prior to joining NFU, she served as an analyst in agriculture policy at the Congressional Research Service, as well as spending over a decade as a journalist covering agricultural and environmental policy. Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here representing the National Farmers Union. As Ben said, I'm the Senior Government Relations Representative, and my portfolio, it really focuses largely on climate change. To do a bit of work on trade and some other issues, but right now in particular, climate is really taking a lot of our time. And so today I'm going to talk about the challenges farmers are facing from climate change and the opportunities that exist to address some of those challenges and how farmers are kind of leading in developing solutions. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the policy tools that we at Farmers Union think would be helpful in kind of helping farmers as they work toward these solutions. So with that, I just, for those of you who aren't familiar with Farmers Union, we are a general farm organization. We're the nation's second largest. We have about 200,000 members across 24 chapters that go across 33 states. And, you know, we really look to policies and to promote issues that further family farms. How do we keep families on the land? How do we keep land in family control? And how do we make sure these farms that kind of help spur strong rural communities stay in business. And so I would be very remiss if I didn't start, and frankly, everything at Farmers Union, everything we do at Farmers Union really starts with the farm economy and talking about kind of where farmers are right now. And this is from USDA. I apologize, I clearly forgot to put the sourcing on this, but this is recent data from USDA's Economic Research Service that basically shows the state of the farm economy right now. Net farm income is has been on kind of a downward trend. It looks like it's projected to go up for 2020. But that increase is largely due to kind of government payments. You know, we've seen a huge amount of spending from the federal government to farmers over the past couple of years, first in the form of market facilitation payments because of the trade war with China and other countries. And then since the beginning of this year, you've had payments to help kind of ease some of the effect of the COVID pandemic, which has been particularly tough for agriculture. You know, farmers lost supply chains overnight and lost markets overnight, and that's been very difficult. So, you know, in addition to kind of these more recent acute problems facing farmers and kind of facing their income, harming their income, you know, we've seen long-term trends of very low prices in farm country, in some cases prices that are below the cost of production. We've seen a lot of overproduction and oversupply on certain commodities. You know, you plant a crop for a year, you can't be as nimble as maybe the market needs. It's a kind of constant problem within agriculture. And so we've seen really low prices for quite some time, and that's really having an effect on farmers. You know, we're losing farms, we're seeing record farm bankruptcies. And so things out there are pretty grim, frankly. I wish I had a rosier picture to paint. And while the government is spending a lot of money, that money isn't necessarily going out evenly to farmers, that it's not always those that have the greatest need that are seeing those payments. So with this in mind, kind of certainly climate change does not make the situation much better. Sorry, I just want to make sure that everyone can see the slide that I'm on. This is a new system. It's got a map and a graph on it. Put that in the chat. I just realized I'm not sure how to use this.
Yep, we can see it, Jenny.
Great, thanks, Ben. Anyway, so in addition to the state of the farm economy, farmers have also been dealing with, for the past several years, kind of a series of extreme weather events. You know, I think the most widespread of these was certainly the flooding in 2019, and that's, you know, on the left we can see where in the Mississippi Valley the flooding took place last year. It was record flooding. I mean, farmhouses and farmland that had been far from water for generations were underwater and destroyed. On the right we have prevent plan acres, so the acres that farmers couldn't plant on and claimed against crop insurance. And I use this slide, I think maybe at the end of this year it'll be replaced with wildfires or hurricanes or, you know, other billion-dollar storms like the derecho, or, you know, you could look at any number of things. You could look at increases in nighttime temperatures and how that's affecting when crops bloom, and you could look at, you know, shifting pest patterns, weather patterns, precipitation patterns. You know, there's a number of things we look at when we see this. But with the backdrop of the farm economy as it is, and then with this increasingly changing climate and weather patterns, you know, it's more pressure on farmers at a time when they don't have the resources at hand necessarily to kind of tackle these challenges head on. You know, certainly when your income isn't where you want it to be, making broad scale changes is difficult. And there are a lot of opportunities within agriculture that I'll get to, but at the end of the day, resources are needed to kind of implement some of these. So, with all of this said, we do know that there are some tactics that will make farmland more resilient and help farmers to adapt. In agriculture, we talk a lot now about soil health, and it's an easy term to talk about building up the organic matter in the soil. And that has a lot of benefits. That kind of helps land absorb moisture better. This is a picture from Oklahoma from a couple of years ago, and I think it's a pretty good show of what happens. On the left, you have a farmer who's really implemented soil health practices. And when we talk about soil health, we're really talking about keeping the soil covered, encouraging a strong root system to keep the soil in place, and including a range of plants. Kind of each plant takes and gives different things to the soil, and introducing grazing wherever possible. And so on the left, you have a farmer that's done that. On the right, you have a farmer that has been using more conventional practices. Now, those practices aren't bad. They aren't wrong. We just know a little bit more now than we did when we started using some of those practices. And so you can see kind of on the left, we had a lot of absorption of the water. On the right, it flooded. And I think you're seeing this as folks adopt some of these practices, that they're having these results, which is really helpful. But not only do using these soil health practices help to kind of absorb soil better, make the land more resilient, prevent flooding, they also help to do things like sequester carbon. There's a lot of benefits to engaging in these practices. Similarly, we know that there are huge renewable energy opportunities on agricultural lands, both in terms of things like solar and wind, but also in terms of producing biofuels feedstocks. We are a long way away from getting rid of liquid fuels in a lot of vehicles. And so biofuels are a sustainable and lower emissions liquid fuel that kind of put us on a path to a cleaner energy future. So, all of these activities will cost money. Implementing these land management practices that are pointed out here, like no-till and cover crops, have a cost. You need seed to plant for cover crops. You need to run the planter. You've got the fuel costs. You need different equipment than farmers have been using through more conventional practices. Similarly, putting in place renewable energy infrastructure is similarly kind of not a cheap proposition, even though there are long-term benefits. And similarly on soil health management, there are kind of long-term benefits in terms of reduced inputs and things like that, but the upfront costs still exist. And so while farmers are figuring out these solutions and really leading and generating these solutions, they need more resources to be able to do this on the scale that we need to do to make our land more resilient and to reduce emissions and to also pull greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And I just want to note that we end up paying for this either way. We either pay for this upfront and provide farmers resources and spend the money on the research to figure out the best way to use the land to make it more resilient, to curb flooding, to curb greenhouse gas emissions, or we spend it on the back end in terms of disaster payments, in terms of crop insurance payments, and kind of all of the other disaster relief that we've seen in recent years from extreme weather events. So at Farmers Union, our members and our grassroots-led policy process has long recognized that climate change exists and has said, our members have said very clearly that there is a solution forward on this, and that farmers have a role and that farmers need to be at the table. And I've been really encouraged through things like both the select committee process on a federal level, but also state efforts and state kind of advisory committees that are bringing farmers to the table on this issue. And that's been really great to see because they need to be there. But at Farmers Union, we think that to improve the soil and to curb emissions, it's going to take broad scale investment. And there's a public good there. And so we can't at this point expect farmers to pay for this all themselves. It's going to be a combination of public and private spending that gets us here. So when we talk about climate policy, we talk about voluntary incentive-based conservation programs, particularly at USDA. There are a number of programs that we could better harness that are already doing some work on soil health and climate-related issues, but that more can be done. How do we use these programs to get greater incentives and funding for long-term management? And how do we make sure these programs are available to farmers who maybe can't take advantage of other kind of private market efforts? Kind of the second piece of our policy is the market-based initiatives. I think the one that's getting most attention right now, of course, is carbon markets. And there's a nascent effort to really kind of bring agriculture in a meaningful way in carbon markets, recognizing the ability of soil to sequester carbon. And so I think those efforts are moving along. I think they are another tool in the toolbox. They will not work for all farms, but they will work for some. And it's certainly a way to bring the private sector to the table. Now with carbon markets, I think there's a lot of kind of guardrails we need to put in place to make sure that farmers aren't taken advantage of and to make sure that we don't see things like corporate land grabs. But I think it's another tool that we should be looking very seriously at. The third piece we talk about at Farmers Union is on-farm energy production and biofuels, and the potential there to really produce green energy and also, make a sustainable green energy future for America. And then the fourth piece for us, and what underlies all of this, is a strong investment in public research. And that's really important. I think the private sector is doing a lot of very interesting things as it applies to agriculture and climate change, and really developing interesting tools, interesting data tools, interesting soil additives, and they're doing a lot of great work. But we know that private sector agricultural research doesn't look at long-term systemic problems in the way that public sector research does, because there has to be a quicker return on investment. And we also need to make sure that the tools that are being developed are available to farmers of all sizes and in an affordable way. So we need to make sure that there's something in the toolbox for everyone. And I know that that's something said in DC a lot, but it's very applicable here. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Mackenzie, turn it back to Ben to talk a little bit more about what's going on Capitol Hill on this front. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was really informative, providing a great kind of base for where farmers are in this country when it comes to this issue. And that last slide really provides a great segue into our next speaker. Our second speaker, of course, is Mackenzie Landa, who serves as counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, where she leads the committee's work on nature-based climate solutions. Before joining this committee, she worked as a legislative aide for several members of Congress, focusing, of course, on agriculture, environmental, energy, animal, and natural resource issues. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today, Mackenzie, and the floor is now yours.
Thanks so much, Ben. And good afternoon, everyone. Like Ben mentioned, my name is Mackenzie Landa. I serve as counsel for the majority staff of the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and I work on natural climate solutions, which, of course, includes agriculture. So in June of this year, the Select Committee released our Climate Action Plan, a 550-page report detailing policy recommendations for Congress on how to address the climate crisis. Our report spanned all sectors of the economy, from transportation to electricity to buildings, industry and manufacturing to, of course, agriculture. It covered nature-based solutions to the climate crisis, and it included sections on resilience and adaptation, environmental justice, labor and a just transition. It was pretty comprehensive. I encourage everyone to check it out on our website, climatecrisis.house.gov/report. And while it is 550 pages, don't worry, we have an executive summary and all sorts of fact sheets and one-pagers. So you don't have to wade through all of those pages. So to write this report, we held over 1,000 stakeholder meetings and received targeted input and feedback from hundreds of individuals and organizations. And in writing the agriculture section in particular, it was really important to us to listen to farmers and ranchers and the folks who represent and work with these agricultural producers because, it was really important for us to produce a document that farmers could really see themselves in and see that their interests were being represented and that we were hearing what they had to say. America's farmers and ranchers are already working hard to improve conservation and provide valuable climate and ecosystems benefits. So we wanted to recommend policies that, if implemented, would make farms and ranchers more profitable, more resilient to extreme weather, and at the same time, help them be an active part of the climate solution. And we know that the potential is there. With more than 900 million acres of agricultural land across the country, the United States has the potential to sequester substantial amounts of carbon in agricultural soils. So that was the first sort of bucket of recommendations that we made. Policies that would help increase agricultural carbon sequestration and resilience through climate stewardship practices, such as, a lot of the things Jenny talked about, no and low-till farming, cover crops, prescribed and rotational grazing, planting perennial crops, agroforestry, those sorts of practices. And so the first thing that the Select Committee plan recommends is that Congress dramatically increase investments in USDA conservation working lands programs, things like the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, as well as USDA land retirement and easement programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, and the Healthy Forest Reserves Program. And the purpose of this was to significantly increase the ability of the federal government to provide farmers and ranchers with additional financial and technical assistance to implement these climate stewardship practices or take that marginal land out of production to allow for increased carbon sequestration. These voluntary conservation programs are consistently oversubscribed, so additional funding is really critical to maximizing that carbon storage in soils. We recommend numerous other policies that would help farmers increase the amount of carbon sequestration, such as setting up regional agroforestry centers, setting national climate stewardship practice goals across all U.S. cropland, supporting organic agriculture, and supporting state soil health initiatives to really help increase that widespread adoption of climate stewardship practices. So while the opportunity for agriculture to be a carbon sink is real and huge, today ag is a source of emissions and contributes about 1/10 of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So that was the second thing we tackled in the report: how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And here again, we really focus on voluntary incentive-based policies. And we started with nitrous oxide from synthetic fertilizer, since roughly half of agricultural emissions come from nitrous oxide. And so the Select Committee recommends several policies to address those emissions, things like increasing financial and technical assistance for improved nutrient management, expanding research and deployment of precision agriculture technologies to allow farmers to apply fertilizer more efficiently, and therefore avoiding overapplication and runoff and those sorts of things, and providing support for climate-smart alternatives to synthetic fertilizer, such as crop rotation, cover cropping, and compost. The other half, roughly, of agricultural emissions come largely from methane from livestock production. So the Select Committee's Climate Action Plan again recommends that Congress increase that targeted financial and technical assistance to farmers and ranchers to implement climate-friendly livestock production practices, things like getting animals out of confinement and feedlot systems and instead really getting them out on the landscape and implementing rotational and prescribed grazing and things like silvopasture. So you may have noticed that many of the policies I've talked about involve increased financial and technical assistance. And while Congress clearly has the authority to appropriate more funds for these efforts, enhanced technical assistance from partners that farmers trust, which might not always be the folks in Washington, D.C., but are folks like NRCS staff, extension services, NGOs, agricultural retailers. These guys are really critical to widespread adoption of climate stewardship practices. You know, I think sometimes, especially in agriculture, the messenger can be as important as the message. So the next set of recommendations focuses on increasing the capacity to provide technical assistance to farmers. And this includes policies such as increasing NRCS staff to provide on-the-ground support to farmers and ranchers, increasing federal support to conservation districts, extension services, land-grant colleges, supporting public-private partnerships, facilitating farmer-to-farmer education and outreach programs, and increasing funding to USDA research agencies and other research partners to promote innovation and increase agricultural climate benefits. So sorry about that, guys, the sounds of working from home. So a smaller but still significant portion of agricultural emissions come from on-farm fuel consumption, from just routine energy use and farm equipment. But farmers and ranchers can reduce those CO2 emissions and at the same time save money by making energy efficiency improvements and investing in dual use renewable energy projects on farm. So for example, solar panels on land shared with sheep, just as an example, or other kinds of livestock. So to address this, the Select Committee plan recommends increasing funding for and expanding the Rural Energy for America program, which provides assistance to farmers for energy efficiency improvements and renewable energy systems. The plan also recommends directing USDA to provide regional and local support for farmers who are transitioning to low emissions equipment, things like grant funding or an equipment loan rental program, and just as some examples. And then finally, the plan recommends that Congress direct USDA to study dual-use energy systems and increase efforts to provide education, outreach, and technical assistance for farmers to integrate those renewable energy projects on land shared with crops or livestock, like I was talking about. So another important aspect of building a fair and equitable climate-friendly food system is supporting the next generation of farmers, as well as socially disadvantaged farmers, which include farmers of color, women, and veteran farmers. With over 370 million acres of farmland expected to change hands over the next 15 years or so, there really are countless opportunities to reshape and rethink the food system in a way that prioritizes climate stewardship, as well as access to healthy, local, and culturally appropriate foods, and diversity among agricultural producers, and those sorts of things. So this climate action plan recommends that Congress expand and increase USDA programs that support beginning, young, and socially disadvantaged farmers and incorporate climate-smart agriculture into those programs. The Select Committee also recommends new programs. Just a few examples are making government-owned farmland available as incubator farms for new beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers, or establishing a federally backed land trust to buy land from retiring farmers and make it available to beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers. We also include important recommendations on coordinating and collaborating with tribal nations and engaging and supporting environmental justice communities on climate stewardship practices, programs, and policies to ensure that we are building towards a fair and equitable food system. So another area that the Select Committee focused on was preservation of farmland. Conversion of farmland to urban development, which then puts pressure to convert natural spaces to cropland, are both real problems. And so I think really the top line from the committee here is to provide and support policies that keep working lands, while at the same time relieving that pressure on natural spaces to be converted to cropland. So finally, and lastly, we address food waste and transportation. Climate-smart agriculture doesn't end with on-farm climate stewardship practices. Food waste is responsible for 8% globally of greenhouse gas emissions, and local and regional food systems reduce the distance food travels, so we cut down on those transportation emissions. So the Select Committee report recommends that Congress support local and regional food systems through federal procurement by expanding market opportunities, and then additionally develop goals and initiatives to reduce food waste. So that was a lot, but I think that, the most exciting thing about all of this is that American agriculture has a real opportunity to go from being a source of emissions to a really powerful carbon sink. And there are so many tools available for policymakers to help farmers both make their operations more profitable and resilient to climate impacts, as well as help farmers be important partners in the fight against climate change. And, I know that us at the committee are doing a lot of thinking about it. There's a lot of legislation that's already been introduced to address some of these things, and we include all those in the Select Committee report. And I know that, folks at the state, local, and regional levels are also doing a lot of thinking. So thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. And I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Great. Thank you, Mackenzie. Really helpful summary of, as you described, a very detailed report, especially for those of us that when it initially came out earlier this year, had a fun couple of days of reading through a few different chapters. So thank you again for that. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit to the final portion of today's webinar, the question and answer session, and we'll answer as many questions as we can from folks in the audience. And if there are any questions we don't get to, I'll make sure to connect the folks that asked the questions with both Jenny and Mackenzie to respond via email. So I've gotten a few questions already. Actually, I had a couple folks send some questions in yesterday and Tuesday, but don't forget, if you have a question, please type it in the box on the left-hand side. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and of course will be made available to all participants. So let me actually just take the first one from the audience chat. Jenny, hopefully you can see that as well. Does the National Farmers Union conduct its own research? If not, where do you get your research recommendations from?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. No, we are an education kind of legislation cooperation organization. So we don't conduct our own research, so it would be lovely if we had the resources to do that. We look a lot toward USDA and the work that comes out of the Agricultural Research Service and the Economic Research Service, and also the land grant university system, I would say, is probably where we get most of our research from. There's also a couple of research institutes that kind of we engage with and kind of keep an eye on what they're doing, just so that we're up to date on things. But so those tend to be where we get our information from.
Great, thank you. I guess I'll take this next question because it was sent ahead of time. Mackenzie, I'll throw it to you first, but Jenny, feel free to chime in as well. Maybe this is kind of a how do we square this circle analogy, if you will. So is there a way to kind of simultaneously implement a system for carbon reduction that both incentivizes long-term carbon storage as well as, on the short-term soil health initiatives? Are those two missions compatible, or are they kind of working in opposition to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I really see those as two of the same thing. I think that a lot of these climate stewardship practices both, are help with long-term carbon storage, but at the same time, we also talk about them in terms of improving soil health. So I really think that a lot of these practices are work simultaneously for both of those things. The only thing I'll add is that in the report we do discuss, the the need to invest additional resources into measuring carbon in the soil for a lot of reasons, but one being that we can see really what practices are the most effective at increasing that soil carbon. So, but I mean, I think as a general matter, we have a pretty good idea, and really those things go hand in hand. But I don't know, Jenny may have different thoughts.
No, I think, Kenzie, you have it right. I mean, one of the advantages in this space is that we're increasingly finding that practices have, especially soil health management practices, and it's kind of why this is such an important piece of the climate policy discussion in agriculture, is that these practices and these management practices have those kind of dual benefits. And you know, there are a lot of other practices out there that you know, kind of may look at one thing or another, but certainly when we get to broad scale soil health management, it both makes land more resilient and sequesters carbon. And I think those are kind of two really important goals.
Great. So the next question, I noticed both of you kind of hit on this topic, so I want to maybe drill down just a touch, and that is energy production on farmland. So maybe I'll throw it to Jenny first, just as kind of obviously a representative of the agriculture community. Is this something that you are seeing kind of more growth in, be it obviously, or be it solar energy production or wind energy production or other types of energy production, or is it more of a kind of medium-term goal, if you will, for your members, or is it something that with the right policy and maybe some additional public sector help, could be implemented in the short term?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ben. I mean, the on-farm renewable energy has a lot of potential. You know, if something like half of U.S. land is in agricultural production, and so there's a lot of space there to capture solar power, to capture wind power, and I think we're seeing increasingly creative ways to do it. There's some great examples of grazing in between solar panels, putting solar panels or wind turbines on marginal land that, probably isn't great to plant on anyway. So there's a lot of interesting ideas on kind of how to have a very symbiotic relationship between renewable energy production. And I say that mostly in terms of wind and solar, and we can talk about different other forms of renewable energy production. But so there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there are a couple of barriers. The cost of these systems is expensive. There are some tax credits, but it may not get all the way. I think farmers are very interested in them, but there's also a lot of, you run into kind of on the kind of solar and wind, and I would also put in kind of methane digesters, which is where you produce methane from food waste and animal waste. There's lots of opportunities there, but there's high upfront costs. And then there's also kind of differing rules state to state in terms of if you can sell energy back into the grid, if you can't, kind of how much you can sell it for. So you run into the cost, you run into a patchwork, but I think farmers are definitely interested, and I think it's a space that probably needs some more public investment in terms of making sure these renewable energy systems are as efficient as they can be and are as cost effective as they can be. But on the bigger question of broad scale renewable energy production that really feeds into the grid, I mean, that becomes a state by state issue just because that's how it's regulated. Great.
Mackenzie, anything to add there? If not, I've got another question for you.
No, I mean, I agree with everything Jenny said. I think the only thing I'll add is that I think one issue with these renewable energy production on farm is just to make sure that we're not creating additional competition for land. I think, in so many areas, farmland is already prohibitively expensive for farmers, and so we don't want to be creating a system where we're then having farmers not only be competing for land with each other, but also like energy development companies and that sort of thing, which is why in the select committee report, we tried to focus on, dual use energy systems and providing resources for farmers to implement those renewable energy systems on their own farms instead of creating that land competition. But yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jenny says, and it does seem like farmers are really interested in a bunch of different areas around the country. So it's cool.
Great. So I want to kind of stay in the energy realm for a second and pick up on one topic that Jenny mentioned in her presentation, and I apologize if I missed this in yours, but that was more kind of focusing on biofuels, low carbon fuels. We've seen this issue come up in a few states, especially on the West Coast. So I guess I was just wondering if this came up in the meetings that you had with obviously a wide variety of stakeholders, and kind of how the committee sees the issue of biofuels, or maybe I'll phrase it as this way, a national low carbon fuel standard.
Sure. So I'll just sort of preface all this by saying that I don't handle, we do discuss a low carbon fuel standard when we do make recommendations with respect to a low carbon fuel standard, but we do it in the transportation section. So our transportation staffer is much more knowledgeable about this than I am. But I mean, you can't work on ag without running into biofuels. So we do, and in the select committee report, what we recommend is building on the RFS to create a national low carbon fuel standard. And what I'll say in terms of ag and land use is that what we do is make sure to sort of build in those guardrails that prevent, land conversion, and at the same time make sure that whatever LCFS that is in our federal future rewards farmers for implementing climate-friendly growing practices, and to reward farmers who are, actively trying to be a part of the climate solution. So, and operate their farms in a sustainable, biodiversity-friendly way, and all of those sorts of things. So, yes, we do definitely address it.
Great. And Jenny, I'm going to take another audience question for you, which is maybe a bit broader than just this webinar, but Alini asks, what are some of the legislative priorities for this year? So take this year either as 2020 or 2021 for the National Farmers Union.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this year has been a bit strange for legislative priorities, and it feels, thanks to COVID, that it's been a lot of moving targets. And it's really highlighted a lot of the kind of structural weaknesses in the agriculture and food systems. And so right now we are really focused on kind of four main areas, and that is coronavirus relief, kind of how do we make sure that the payments that are going out to farmers that I spoke about earlier are really going to places and to the places of need. Right now, kind of the bigger the farm, the bigger the payment, and that's some merit to that, but that's not keeping smaller guys in business. And so kind of how do we make sure those payments go out equitably into the places where they're needed? And then, so we're also focusing on kind of livestock issues and how to make sure we are currently we have a very consolidated livestock sector. Meat production, farmers have very few places to get their livestock slaughtered because the ownership of most processing plants comes down to 4 companies. There's very few processing plants, which is why we saw disruptions in the spring as workers got sick because they were being forced to work when they were sick, and plants were shutting down. Farmers, independent family farmers, had nowhere to slaughter their animals, and there's a very small window weight-wise in which you can slaughter a cow or a pig, which led to farmers kind of raising animals that they then couldn't sell, which is certainly problematic. So that's the second piece, and kind of looking at that consolidation and how do we make sure there's more slaughter options and local processing options for farmers? How do we make sure they're getting a fair price for livestock, and that they aren't being squeezed on all sides by court consolidation in the livestock sector? The third current priority, of course, is and this is a very big one for us, is kind of rural resilience. And how do we make sure that rural areas have the medical resources, the broadband resources, kind of other resources they need to kind of stay in business, to stay healthy? We're very, very concerned with some of the proposed changes at the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service is vital to rural America, and things like mail slowdowns and kind of trying to privatize portions of the Postal Service is incredibly worrying. This is how people do business. This is how they get the medications they need. And so these things need to keep running in a reliable way. Similarly with rural broadband, especially with rural broadband in terms of making sure kids, if they're learning remotely, have access to resources. I mean, we hear stories all the time about, kids in rural areas having to drive to the McDonald's parking lot to steal their Wi-Fi, or, church parking lots. Churches in some parts of the country have done a great job in terms of kind of extending their Wi-Fi to their parking lot or to their spaces to make sure that kids can use it, but that's not a long-term solution. And then the our fourth legislative priority is actually on climate and biofuels, and making sure that as we talk about climate change, we're kind of talking about it in the way, in this kind of voluntary incentive-based market-driven way that, I think the Select Committee report gets to for the most part, and kind of making sure that farmers are at the table for those discussions. So that is what's keeping us busy at Farmers Union.
Just a small few things.
Just a couple of things.
Yeah. Well, with that, I would like to extend a final thank you to our presenters, Jenny and Mackenzie. Thank you both very much. We greatly appreciate the expertise that each of you were able to provide, and the time that you took out of your busy schedules to join us here today. So thank you. And of course, thanks to all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, again, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be made available shortly. Our next webinar, in fact, our final webinar in this series, will be in 2 weeks on October 22nd, exploring the potential impacts of a move to permanent daylight savings time. To register or find out more information about the entire series, please visit www.ncsl.org, or you can just simply send me an email. Again, thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL. Have a great day.